the tyranny in Canada continues. So Justin Trudeau admitted yesterday that the blockades have been lifted and that traffic is moving freely between the United States and Canada. But he says the state of emergency is not over, because here's the beauty of states of emergency. They're never over so long as the tyrant wishes them to extend. So here is your smiley-faced tyrant, Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau with his very measured high voice and his not looking like Fidel Castro at all. And stop that, you. Stop it. Here's Justin Trudeau.
But even though the blockades are lifted across border openings right now, even though things seem to be resolving very well in Ottawa, this state of emergency is not over.
It's never over. It's magic. So what is the state of emergency justifying at this point? According to the UK Daily Mail, a Canadian MP says the bank account of a single mom with a minimum wage job has been frozen because she donated $50 to the Freedom Convoy. Conservative lawmaker Mark Strahl says the mom, named only as Brianne, has had her life ruined for donating a small sum to the anti-vax mandates protest. Strahl shared Brianne's story as concerns grow that scores of ordinary citizens will no longer be able to pay for food and basics after their accounts were frozen for donating to a group of protesters. Brianne is a single mom from Chilliwack working a minimum wage job. She gave $50 to the convoy when it was 100% legal. She has not participated in any other way. Her bank account has now been frozen. This is who Justin Trudeau is actually targeting with his Emergencies Act orders. Right, but he says things like this. And even though he's worn blackface 100,000 times, as, a very convenient form of camouflage or something at Halloween parties, dressed up as a black person. And even though he's been a terrible prime minister that no one really likes, the emergency is not yet over. And in fact, says Justin Trudeau, if you voted against the invocation of the Emergencies Act, well, that just means that you don't trust the government to make important, momentous... Yes, that's correct. We don't trust the government to make important, momentous decisions because you suck at this.
I can't imagine that anyone who votes no tonight is doing anything other than indicating that they don't trust the government to make incredibly momentous and important decisions at a very difficult time.
Yeah, I do not trust you to make momentous and important decisions, like invoking the Emergencies Act for the first time since it was actually initiated. There was a predecessor act that had been invoked a couple of times. This is the first time since 1970 when it was written that it's actually been invoked, because there are a bunch of people who are setting up jacuzzis in the middle of the street in Ottawa. Ottawa's police chief, by the way, is just embracing this and just going full scale. He says, if you're involved in the protest in any way, we'll find you, we'll track you down. It doesn't matter if the protest ends. We'll track you down well after the end of that protest. And we will unleash all law enforcement powers at our disposal in order to... By the way, has this happened anywhere on earth with regard to the Black Lives Matter protests/riots that involved $2 billion in direct property damage in the United States? Has any police chief ever said anything remotely like this about Black Lives Matter? Of course not, because it's the cause that matters. It is not about the actual law violation. Here is Steve Bell, who is the Ottawa police chief, talking about this.
If you are involved in this protest, we will actively look to identify you and follow up with financial sanctions and criminal charges. Absolutely. This investigation will go on for months to come. It has many, many different streams, both from a federal financial level, from a provincial licensing level, from a criminal code level, from a municipal breach of court order, breach of court injunction level. It will be a complicated and time-consuming investigation that will go on for a period of time. You have my commitment that investigation will continue, and we will hold people accountable for taking our streets over.
In fact, the Ottawa mayor came out, his name is Jim Watson. He said, all those trucks that we impounded and that we sort of grabbed so that we could move all the other trucks, what if we just kept them? What if we just seized their property and we'll figure out a way to sell them and keep them? This is full-scale tyranny, guys. This has nothing to do with property rights. It has nothing to do with freedom of speech or dissent. None of that matters because Justin Trudeau decided that this was an emergency. Okay, this is not under any legal definition an emergency. Here's the mayor of Ottawa talking about just seizing property.
This is costing a small fortune for the taxpayers of Ottawa. And that's one of the reasons why, under the Emergency Act, I've asked our solicitor and our city manager, how can we keep the tow trucks and the campers and the vans and everything else that we've confiscated and sell those pieces of equipment to help recoup some of the costs that our taxpayers are absorbing.
Okay, well, that's great. So they're just seizing property, and maybe they'll just sell it. Maybe they'll just sell it based on nothing. Perfect. Meanwhile, in a piece of quote-unquote police brutality that would have made national news in the United States, had, of course, the cause been something that people cared about. And remember, this is the same national news media that ginned up a story out of nothing about American border agencies whipping migrants across the southern border, and it didn't happen. They were literally holding reins, and they treated it as though it was a whip. Okay, that was the American media. Here, you have video of a woman being run over by a horse in Canada, and apparently seriously injured. The Ottawa police originally denounced the reports of the woman's death as misinformation, which of course is correct, but then they claimed no one was injured at all. And then the Ottawa police announced that their special investigations unit was going to investigate, and they found that, yeah, it turned out the lady got trampled by the horse, which you could see because it's on video. Here's a lady at an Ottawa protest being trampled by an Ottawa mounted police person.
Come on through. What is happening here? Wow, what is this lady doing? Trampling horses. Stop it. Stop it. What?
Okay, so that's everything is going well in Ottawa, but at least Justin Trudeau gets to maintain his pride. That's the really, really important thing. By the way, the New York Times reported last weekend that police in Ottawa had arrested protesters at gunpoint. Prominent Canadian journalists suggested that this was wrong. Now, apparently, the New York Times reporter, Sarah Maslinier, who shares a byline on a contested piece with colleague Natalie Kitroff, she says, we saw these arrests transpire firsthand. In addition, we have multiple interviews from people this happened to, including David Paisley, quoted in the article. What really is blowing my mind is the wave of journalists saying we didn't see what we saw. Well, welcome to how you guys normally cover issues in the United States, gang. The New York Times at its very finest. So, for all of the folks who tend to believe that government in the West could never go tyrannical, I just remind you that government in the West just went tyrannical to a wide chorus of nothing from the mainstream media. That the government in Canada has no actual justification for maintaining this status of emergency. By the way, they have no actual justification for maintaining their COVID restrictions at this point. Boris Johnson in Britain announced over the weekend that essentially we're done. He said we have no more pandemic restrictions in Britain. This is Boris Johnson, not the United States. This is in UK.
First, we will remove all remaining domestic restrictions in law. Until the 1st of April, we will still advise people who test positive to stay at home. But after that, we will encourage people with COVID-19 symptoms to exercise personal responsibility.
Okay, but meanwhile in Canada, they're like, we're not going to do any of that, even though the emergency really doesn't exist. It's important that Justin Trudeau maintain the image that Canada's authorities are in complete control. They will force you to mask just for the sake of it. They will force you to vax just for the sake of it at this point. And if you disobey, they'll freeze your bank account. Maybe you get trampled with a horse. I mean, it depends on how things are going that day. Maybe you have your truck seized by the government. This sort of stuff ought to scare you if you love freedom in free countries at all. It turns out that freedom and threats to it come in many different guises, from full-scale guerrilla warfare and invasion in Ukraine to top-down tyrannical authority in Canada. Those threats to freedom are very real. These are not the same threats of freedom, nor are they of the same scale, because presumably at some point Justin Trudeau will be removed from power and the Emergencies Act will end in Canada. We can at least hope. But the fact that governments act like this, even in the so-called liberal West, should remind everybody that when the government seizes authority, it is very, very reluctant to give it up at all. We're in a battle for the culture and for our values. Like and subscribe to help keep our videos on the front line of the fight and top of your feed.